Now, to explore this in a bit more detail, I'm delighted to welcome Alicja Bachulska, a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a China expert. Welcome to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, certainly. So tell me, Alicja, before we get into the details on this, what do you see as the most constructive outcomes that we can expect from President Duda's visit?
I think that very realistically speaking, I think that there will not be that many fundamental or deal-breaking arrangements as a result of this trip. President Duda is very focused on economic cooperation with China, and this is not a novelty for China watchers in Europe or here in the CEE region. President Duda has for many years built this image of himself as a person or a politician who is very friendly to Beijing. He reiterated many times that he's allegedly a close partner and a friend of Xi Jinping. And this dates back to almost a decade ago, when during the period that we now see as the renaissance of China-CE cooperation, President Duda visited China, and then Xi Jinping visited Poland in 2016. So this relationship has been a long time in the making, but at the same time, I think that it is largely ceremonial in terms of the political significance of the kind of relationship they're having. So I wouldn't be that optimistic or that enthusiastic when it comes to the actual outcomes of this visit. There will be a lot of symbolical gestures of friendship. There will be some potentially market access openings, maybe a few MOUs, and also potentially cooperation on cultural exchanges, academic exchanges, but I wouldn't be overly enthusiastic about any kind of qualitative change that we might see as a result of this trip.
Okay, so symbolic is really how you perceive this visit. Now, as I say, one of the objectives that President Duda stated was China's support in getting peace in Ukraine. Is there any reason why China should pressure Russia to stop the war and maybe to pull out of occupied territories? I mean, what's in it for China?
Very frankly, I think that we should abandon this perspective where we believe that Xi Jinping has any real leverage over Vladimir Putin when it comes to pressuring him to end the war in Ukraine. If you look at the position of Beijing towards the war in Ukraine for the past 2 years, it has been very consistent. And China very consistently has helped Russia, on the one hand, in its war efforts by increasing trade and selling a lot of dual usage items, such as microchips, to Russia. But also diplomatically, although China does not want to openly support Russia in its effort, it is also seeing the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between the US, NATO, and Russia. So there is very little belief that Ukraine has its own agency. People in Ukraine are seen as not really agents of change or people who have their own interests in mind, but rather as quote unquote puppets of the US. So strategically speaking for China, Ukraine is not really a state that has a lot of power to change the power play between the US and Russia. So I think we have to be very, very cautious in terms of understanding the implications of that, because in a way, the position Beijing has towards this conflict also implies that it is somehow supporting Russia's talking points and Russia's strategic interests. The war in Ukraine as a proxy war for China is also a war between the West and the autocracies such as Russia and China. And the win of Ukraine, or the kind of win Ukrainians would like to see, would also be seen in Beijing as the loss of interest or the loss of the sphere of influence of Russia and China.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. I just want to follow that up just for a second. I mean, so we're talking really about using Ukraine as a proxy, really, to reflect China's strategic ambitions and its what it sees as its long-term relationship with Russia. Now, many commentators have said that they do see an axis forming with North Korea, or between North Korea, China and Russia, designed as a counterweight to US and Western hegemony around the world. Would you agree with that view, and why?
In a way, yes. And China has been very open in reaffirming its interest in this context. And it dates back to the period already before the war in Ukraine. So, for example, if you look at the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping right before the beginning of the war in Ukraine, basically 2 weeks before the outbreak, when the Winter Olympic Games were taking place in China, Russia and China issued a joint statement on what they believe to be the need to readjust or change the international order. And already back then, before the war in Ukraine, Moscow and Beijing were very clear when it comes to reassuring that they are standing back to back, protecting their own interests in the grander, bigger scheme of things, and within the framework of the strategic rivalry between China and Russia. So, for example, Moscow back then and Vladimir Putin said that he opposes, and Russia opposes what it sees as the development of alternative frameworks for cooperation on the Indo-Pacific led by the US, which for China are also seen as a danger. And then vice versa, Xi Jinping and China said that they're also opposing NATO's enlargement in Eastern Europe. So very clearly, both Moscow and Beijing are looking at what's happening right now on NATO's eastern flank and in the Indo-Pacific in the context of the rivalry with the US. It's a systemic rivalry, and because of the fact that both China and Russia do not really have any allies, formal allies, but they don't need actually to have formal allies. They're very fine working hand in hand and back to back, fighting what they perceive as their shared enemy, the US.
Indeed. So bearing that in mind, shouldn't Europe be careful about allowing China to invest so deeply and heavily into Europe, bearing in mind the risks to cybersecurity, the loss of sensitive technologies, and so on?
Of course. And I think that in this context, Duda's visit to China is very symptomatic of the disconnect between the way he's promoting his trip and his engagement or re-engagement with China and what's happening in the European conversation on the future of EU-China relations. So at the level of the EU, we are clearly witnessing a process where a much more assertive policy is being formed. Under the previous commission with Ursula von der Leyen, there was a clear push towards designing new tools to counteract Chinese influence, both economically and politically in Europe. And Duda's perspective and the image of his trip that is being now promoted is very much not in line with what's happening in the European conversation on China. And we have to be very cautious not to overlook this mismatch and to be very clear when it comes to understanding the implications of China's strategic interests, both in the context of the war in Ukraine, but also the broader cooperation mindset that China is promoting as an allegedly apolitical actor or an actor that wants only so-called win-win cooperation. That is part of China's broader attempt to spread its influence in Europe. And we really should not be naive in terms of understanding that this kind of rhetoric is not only in line with Beijing's interests, but also in line with Russia's interests.
Right. So proceed with extreme caution, I think, is the message. Alicja Bachulska, Policy Fellow at the European Council, thank you very much indeed for sharing your insights with our audience. Have a good evening.
You too.